right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling a topic that I know a lot of you have been asking about, and frankly, it's one that's always kind of fascinated me too.
Oh yeah, this one's a doozy.
It is. We're going deep on Dan Rather and the JFK assassination.
Buckle up.
Seriously. We're looking specifically at a chapter from this book, The Rather Narrative, by Monty Evans. And, well, let's just say he raises some pretty eyebrow-raising questions about Rather's whole account of what happened that day in Dallas.
Yeah, I mean, when you really start digging into the details of what Rather said he saw and did, some things just don't add up.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to lay it all out, examine the inconsistencies, and see how it all connects, or maybe doesn't, to some of the broader JFK conspiracy theories out there.
Right, and just to be clear, this isn't about attacking Dan Rather or his whole career.
Oh, no, not at all.
We're really just zeroing in on November 22nd, 1963. What was he doing? Where was he? And why does it seem like his story keeps changing?
Okay, so let's set the scene. Picture it. Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. The motorcade's going through Dealey Plaza, and suddenly, shots ring out. Now, Dan Rather, who was CBS's Southern Bureau Chief at the time, was in Dallas to cover this event.
You'd think he'd be right there in the action, wouldn't you?
You would. But that's where things get a little strange.
Oh, yeah.
Rather claims that when the shooting happened, he was actually standing on an on-ramp to the Stemmons Freeway. He said he was there to get a film drop from the motorcade. But when you think about that for a second, that puts him on like the opposite side of this massive triple underpass from Dealey Plaza. I mean, it's separated by a 25-foot high railroad embankment, like 5 sets of train tracks.
Miles away.
Yeah, basically. It seems like a really, really weird place for the guy in charge of coordinating coverage to be. Why wouldn't he be, I don't know, at the newsroom or somewhere closer to the actual event?
Right, like, shouldn't the Southern Bureau Chief, the guy in charge of making sure they get the story, be somewhere, you know, a little more central to the action? Why send him off on what seems like a pretty minor task, all the way out there on a freeway on-ramp?
Exactly. I mean, couldn't someone else have handled that film drop? It's almost like maybe he was deliberately put in that location for some reason.
Ooh, that's interesting.
Right, like was he supposed to see something specific? Or maybe was someone trying to keep him out of the loop?
It's a real head-scratcher.
It is, and it gets weirder.
Of course it does.
Because then we get into what Rather did immediately after the shooting. Like, in some accounts, he says he hopped in a cab and rushed back to the studio.
Makes sense, right? Gotta get back and report.
But then, in his autobiography, he says he actually ran all the way back.
So which is it? A nice, calm cab ride? Or a mad dash through the streets of Dallas?
Yeah, I mean, those are two very different scenarios. And you have to wonder, if he was really there, on that on-ramp, wouldn't he have seen something, someone running away? I mean, a lot of witnesses reported seeing suspicious guys fleeing the grassy knoll right after the shots.
Especially a seasoned reporter, like, Rather, you'd think he'd be paying attention to those sorts of details.
Absolutely. And then there's the timing of it all.
Yeah.
Rather says that he got back to the KRLD studios before anyone even knew what was going on. Like, he claims he's the one who told everyone to turn on their radios and police scanners.
Wow. So he's saying he beat the news back to the station.
He is. But if you look at the timeline from the UPI bulletins that went out, it says that the news of the shooting went out at 12:34 p.m. That's only 4 minutes after the assassination.
4 minutes. To get from that freeway on-ramp back to the studio, through the chaos and the crowds.
Yeah, it seems almost impossible even if he was sprinting like an Olympian.
It really does. It makes you wonder, was he getting information from somewhere else, or is he just not remembering the timeline correctly?
Or both. And then there's this, CBS Radio, acting on information from Dan Rather, mind you, actually announced that President Kennedy was dead at 1:16 p.m.
That's a bold move. And a full 17 minutes before the official announcement of death.
So way before anyone else was saying it.
Wow.
And Rather's explanation for this is that he had talked to a doctor and a priest at Park Run Hospital on the phone, and they told him Kennedy was dead.
Okay, but who were these people? Did he ever name them?
Nope.
And did he try to confirm this information with anyone else? Or was it just, okay, a doctor and a priest said it, so it must be true?
It's a good question. It's strange, right? I mean, other reporters were at Parkland, too, and they weren't getting the same information.
Seems like Rather had this, like, secret source or something.
I know. And here's where it gets really interesting, okay? Later on, when Rather is asked about this whole premature announcement thing, he writes in his autobiography, and I quote, "It does not take much imagination to know what was going through my head. Most of that time would I be seeking another line of work." End quote. Now, isn't that a bizarre thing to be focused on in that moment?
It is a bit odd, isn't it? You'd think he'd be more concerned about the president, the country, the enormity of the situation.
Right. But it seems like his main concern was whether he was going to get fired for reporting something that wasn't true.
Right.
Not exactly the reaction you expect from a journalist in the middle of, like, the biggest news story of the century.
It does make you wonder if there was maybe something else going on there, something behind the scenes.
Right. Some pressure he was feeling.
Exactly.
So we've got a strange location, conflicting accounts of his movements, a way too early announcement of death based on these mysterious sources. And you know what? The Dan Rather rabbit hole goes even deeper.
We got to talk about the Zapruder film. The home movie that captured the assassination?
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other can of worms, right?
It is. And of course, Dan Rather is right in the middle of it.
Of course he is.
So the Zapruder film, as I'm sure most people know, is like the key piece of evidence in this whole thing. It's the only film that shows the entire assassination sequence.
And it's been, analyzed and debated for decades.
Exactly. And wouldn't you know it, Dan Rather is the guy who tracked down Abraham Zapruder, the guy who filmed it.
Oh, boy.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Rather's story about how he found Zapruder is, well, let's just say it's a little hard to believe.
A little. I'd say it's pretty far-fetched.
Okay, fair enough. So he says that CBS started looking for anyone who might have been filming in Dealey Plaza, right after the shooting.
Okay.
And they're going around asking people, and they get these really vague descriptions from anonymous sources.
So, like what? Someone saw a guy with a camera?
Right. Someone saw a guy with a camera. Someone else thought he might be in the clothing business.
And from that, they somehow figure out it's Zapruder.
Yep, like magic. Keep in mind, this is all happening in the hours after the president's been assassinated. There's chaos, confusion.
Yeah, pandemonium.
Exactly. And yet, Rather's team is able to track down this random guy in a huge crowd based on basically nothing.
It does make you wonder if someone maybe, pointed them in the right direction.
Right. Like maybe someone wanted to make sure CBS got that film.
And then the question becomes why?
Well, for starters, we know the Zapruder film is missing some frames, right?
Yeah, frames 155 and 156, and then 208 to 211.
Gone. Poof. And a lot of people think those missing frames might have contained some pretty crucial evidence.
Evidence that was intentionally removed, maybe?
That's the theory. And there's this researcher, David Lifton, who believes those frames were removed at the CIA's National Photo Interpretation Center. It's this really sophisticated photo lab.
And he thinks it happened before the film was given to the Warren Commission?
Right. So if that's true, how did the CIA get the film in the first place?
I mean, wasn't it with Zapruder?
Well, that's the thing. According to this book, Final Disclosure, by David Bellin, who was counsel to the Warren Commission, he says that Dan Rather was actually the first person to have the Zapruder film after the assassination.
Wait a minute. So Rather had the film, but he says in his autobiography that he never had it.
Another inconsistency. Bellin's pretty clear about this. He says Rather took possession of the film and that he was even able to get it processed quickly.
Expedited processing.
Yeah, like someone wanted to get a look at that film ASAP.
So if Bellin's telling the truth, that means Rather had the film before it supposedly went to that CIA lab.
Which means he could have been the one who gave it to them.
Okay, so we have the Zapruder film potentially changing hands. We've got missing frames. And it gets even crazier because then Rather gets to see the film. And this is where his honest mistake comes in.
Ah, yes, the infamous honest mistake.
So Rather goes on TV and describes what he saw in the film. Specifically, he says that when Kennedy was hit, his head snapped forward.
But when the public finally got to see the film, it was pretty obvious that wasn't what happened at all.
Nope, the film clearly shows Kennedy's head snapping backward after the shot.
And that's not some little detail that you could easily miss.
No, it's very clear, and it actually supports the idea that there was a second shooter, someone on the grassy knoll firing from the front.
Right, but Rather's description, even though it was wrong, fit perfectly with the whole lone gunman theory.
The Warren Commission's narrative.
Exactly. It's like he accidentally gave them evidence, even though what he said he saw wasn't true.
And of course, when people called him out on this, he said it was just an honest mistake, blamed it on the film's lawyer for not letting him take notes while he was watching it.
But come on, it's a pretty major detail to get wrong. And here's the kicker. He was the only reporter who was allowed to see that film for almost 10 years.
10 years. Seriously.
Seriously. Time Life, the magazine that bought the film from Zapruder, kept it under wraps.
And they were pretty cozy with the CIA, weren't they?
Oh, yeah, so it's not surprising they didn't want anyone to see it.
But why give Dan Rather, the guy who totally misrepresented what happened in the film, exclusive access to it?
It just doesn't make sense, does it? Was it really just a coincidence? Or was there something more to it? Like, did they know he would say the wrong thing and support the lone gunman theory?
It's a question worth asking.
Yeah.
So let's recap. We've got a weird location, conflicting stories about what Rather did, an early announcement of death, an improbable story about findings of Pruder, missing frames, a misrepresentation of the film, and exclusive access to the film for a decade. Starting to see a pattern here.
Absolutely. It's starting to look less like a bunch of random events and more like something was going on behind the scenes, like someone was pulling strings.
And remember, CBS didn't just send Rather to Dallas on a whim. They actually quadrupled their staff for Kennedy's visit. Why? It wasn't like this was some major high-profile event. It was just a routine trip to a heartland city. Why all the extra manpower?
Makes you wonder if maybe they knew something was going to happen.
Spooky. It reminds me of what Carl Bernstein said about CBS being a valuable asset for the CIA.
Oh, yeah, Bernstein, the Watergate guy.
Yeah, he made some pretty bold claims about CBS and the CIA.
And when you look at all these details, it's hard to dismiss that as just some crazy conspiracy theory.
Right. Like maybe there's something to it.
It's pretty intriguing, isn't it?
Intriguing. I'm starting to think it's more like downright disturbing.
Why?
Because it's like we're uncovering this whole hidden layer of history that someone tried to bury.
And the question is why? What were they trying to hide?
Man, it's a lot to take in, isn't it? We started off just asking, what was Dan Rather's role in all this? What did he do that day? And now it feels like we're in this crazy maze of conspiracies and unanswered questions.
Yeah, it's definitely a story that makes you think, that's for sure. And it really makes you question how much we can really know about the past,
So where do we even go from here? If what we've been talking about Rather, if all that's true, if his story really is full of all these holes, I mean, does that make the whole conspiracy theory thing seem more believable?
Well, I think that's the question, isn't it? If we can't even trust the firsthand account of a guy like Rather, who was right there, then what can we trust? Does it mean that the official story, the lone gunman, maybe that's not as solid as everyone thought?
I mean, it makes you wonder if there are other problems with the official story, right? If one part of it is so messed up.
Yeah, it definitely makes you question everything you thought you knew.
So here's the big question, the one that's really been bugging me. What happened to the Zapruder film when it was with Rather? And why would the CIA have wanted it so badly?
Yeah, good question. Was it tampered with? Did they remove those missing frames to cover something up? Or is there something else going on that we haven't even thought of?
It's like trying to put a puzzle together when you don't have all the pieces, and the ones you do have don't quite fit.
That's a great analogy. But that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating, right? It makes you think critically, makes you question everything.
So what should our listeners be taking away from this? What should they be thinking about after this deep dive?
I'd say, think about this. If even something as seemingly straightforward as the JFK assassination can be so full of mystery and contradictions, what does that say about our ability to truly understand the past? And maybe even more importantly, how can we use that critical thinking, that questioning, to look at the news we get today?
That's a really good point. It reminds us that history isn't always black and white. There are always different sides to the story, and people might have hidden agendas, and things can be manipulated.
Oh, absolutely. And as we've seen with Dan Rather and the JFK assassination, even people you think you can trust might not be so reliable after all.
It's definitely a cautionary tale. Be vigilant, question everything, and never stop looking for the truth.
Well said.
Well, folks, that's our deep dive into Dan Rather and the JFK assassination. It's been a wild ride, and I have a feeling this story is going to keep us all talking and wondering for years to come. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.